Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Thursday morning weekly Parsha Shiur. We actually have three Parshas this week. We have Vayakhel, we have Parsha Pekudei, and we have Parsha Hachodesh, which means that this Shabbos is also Shabbos Chazak, where we conclude the entire Chumash Shemos. This Shabbos is also Shabbos Mevorchim Nisan, where we usher in the month of miracles, and it means it's also time to start getting ready for Pesach. I'm going to start with a beautiful vort on Parshas Vayakhel, and then we're going to go after a couple of minutes into Parshas Pekudei and see with Hashem's help if we can connect the two. So I want to start with an observation. It's a silly observation. It's an observation of my own, but it's an observation nonetheless that I'd like to begin with. L'chaim. Of all of the stories that the Torah shares with us, the creation of the world, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the Jewish people in Mitzrayim, the Jewish people in the desert, Moshe Rabbeinu, of all the amazing stories that the Torah shares with us that we study, that they're not just stories, of course, they're there to teach us lessons. But of all these things that the Torah shares with us, how many of these stories ever go from the beginning till the end without there ever being any problem? Without anything going wrong? How many of the stories go off without a hitch? Things are intended to go a certain way. They're set in position to go in the way that they're supposed to, and it works exactly as it was intended to. I can only think, as I give this shiur here on Thursday morning, right before Shabbos Mevorchim Nisan, Tafshin Pei Gimel, 2023. I can only actually think of one. And it's the stories we read about in Parshas Vayakhel and Pekudei. Otherwise, every other story in the Torah, if you think about it, either ends in complete disaster or at least has some significant disaster along the way. From the creation of the world, where Hashem creates everything beautifully and perfectly, gives humanity one instruction, humanity which consists exactly of two people, right? Or maybe two people and their children. That gives them one instruction, and they cannot contain themselves for 3 hours. If it's the stories of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, where they all struggle to have children, and they have Avraham and Yitzchak have children who are Rishoyim. And when Yaakov has sons who are all tzaddikim, but they fight with each other, and when they almost kill Yosef, and Yosef, etc., etc. Every story, Hashem gives the Torah to the Jewish people. 40 days later, they worship the Egel Azov. Hashem brings them to the borders of Eretz Yisrael. We'll learn later on. And they send spies and they sabotage the whole mission. Moshe Rabbeinu was supposed to go into Eretz Yisrael. That ends in disaster. Everything, I get it. It's part of what makes the stories intriguing and interesting, and there's a journey here, etc. But I think the one exception to this rule is the story of the Mishkan. From the beginning, when the mitzvah is given, until the conclusion when it's carried out and built, and instructions are given in terms of how to conduct oneself in this Mishkan, pretty much everything happens as smoothly as possible. An instruction is given that the Mishkan be built. The instruction is conveyed. The Jewish people, all in one of the greatest miracles of Jewish history, bring more money than is necessary for the construction of the Mishkan. It ends up being constructed, as we'll read in Parshas Pekudei, Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe, exactly as Hashem instructed Moshe, although maybe that's not as simple as it sounds. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But generally speaking, it ends up being constructed exactly as Hashem intended. Hashem's presence rests in the Mishkan. The Jewish people fulfill in the Mishkan exactly what they're supposed to. They offer up sacrifices and korbanos. And the Mishkan functions beautifully, always. We don't ever read anywhere in the Torah that there was some dysfunction or some glitch in the function, in the function of the Mishkan, in the construction of the Mishkan, in the deconstruction of the Mishkan, in the transporting the Mishkan from one place to the other, in the gathering of the materials necessary to put together the Mishkan, right? Remember that it was constructed, the Mishkan was constructed intentionally in order to be able to move from one place to another. The Leviim did so. They were given specific instructions on how to do so. They were told that if they violate the instructions, it could end in capital, it could end in death. They never violated. Everything goes off perfectly. Imagine Lahavdil Elef Havdolis, imagine some kind of a show or, or something like that where there's no problem, where there's no, imagine a storyline where there's no problem. In fact, I'll tell you how far this goes. In fact, not only is the Mishkan constructed and collected and built, without anything going wrong, when the Jewish people go into Eretz Yisrael, they take the Mishkan together with them. The Mishkan is with them, as I mentioned in one of the previous weeks, the Mishkan is with them for about 440 years until Shlomo HaMelech builds the first Beis HaMikdash. And according to the teachings that we have from the Medrash, from Chazal, actually the Mishkan was never destroyed. Chazal tell us because it was made by Moshe Rabbeinu, and Ma'aseh Yedei Moshe Nitzchim, the handiwork of Moshe Rabbeinu, is eternal. So actually the Mishkan was never destroyed. The Beis HaMikdash, the first and the second, was Rahman al-Islam destroyed. The Mishkan never. It was hidden, it was buried, it was placed under the ground, etc. So actually it's sort of the untouchable. It's that part of the Chumash where everything goes, where everything goes right as it was intended to. Anyways, I wanted to start with that observation. We'll see soon in a few minutes. It's actually not exactly as simple as it sounds. Things could have gone wrong, but they didn't, and we'll soon see. But first, what was the purpose of the building of the Mishkan? Why? Hashem said, build for me a Mishkan and I'll live there. What was the purpose of it? We're given different explanations, right? Rashi says in the beginning of Parsha Pekudei very famously that this was a sign, this was an eidos, Rashi said. This was a testimony for the whole world that Hashem had forgiven the Jews for the sin of the Egel Azov. It was a home for Hashem. It was a place where the Rabbi Shalom spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu. All communication between Hashem and Moshe, once the Mishkan was built, took place through the Mishkan. So it's safe to say that there were many different functions that the Mishkan served. And again, we don't find anywhere in Chumash that there was a disruption as long as the Mishkan was around in the function of the Mishkan. It seems to have served its purpose exactly as was intended. Okay. If you have a Chumash in front of you, open up in the beginning of Parshas Vayakhel, Perek Lamed Hey, Possuk Chav Beis. Perek Lamed Hey, Possuk Chav Beis. Here the Torah is describing how the Jewish people all brought their wealth, the gold, the silver, the copper. They brought their jewelry. They brought all things necessary so that sufficient materials could be gathered for the construction of the Mishkan. Says the Possuk, Vayovoyu ho'anoshim al hanoshim. The men came al hanoshim. Rashi says this should be translated as together with the women. The men came together with the women. Kol nediv lev, every generous person came. Heviu choch v'nezem, they brought rings and nose rings, tabas v'chumas, signet rings, girdles, kol kli zov, all different types of golden vessels, and they brought it to the Mishkan. M'chol ish asher heinif, and every man that brought an offering of gold to Hashem, they all came together to bring, again, this was one of the only times in Jewish history when they had to actually stop the fundraising efforts. Later the Torah will say that a koil b'machane, an announcement was released in the camp telling the Jews to stop bringing money. I once heard a fundraiser joke and said, ever since that Koil B'machan, ever since that announcement was released in the camp, he says all Jewish rabbis and fundraisers have been regretting it for all eternity, because an announcement was made telling the Jews, stop bringing the money, we have enough. All right. But the Possuk describes how all Jews came, the men together with the women. With regard to the expression of the Possuk in the beginning of Possuk Chav, Vayavoyu ho'anoshim al hanoshim, it's an irregular expression. The men, literally translated, ho'anoshim al hanoshim, means the men on the women. So Rashi says the pshat is im hanoshim usmuchen aleihen. The men came together with their wives. Usmuchen aleihen means they came close after them. So what Rashi is explaining is that the women were more enthusiastic about bringing these gifts to the Mishkan. Why were they more enthusiastic? The Torah doesn't say. The simple understanding is because the women are more spiritually in tune. Women were more excited about the idea of building a home for Hashem, of bringing this added kedusha into Klal Yisrael. So they were more excited. Vayakhel ha'anoshim al hanoshim means the men were also excited. The men were also eager to bring their jewelry, to make their donations. Not as excited as the women, but nevertheless sufficiently excited, and everybody came. All right, this is according to Rashi. This is the way. This is what the Possuk means. Again, the expression ha'anoshim al hanoshim, Rashi says, means that the men came second, behind the women. Women first, men second. And here there is a commentary from the Sfas Emmes. It's actually in his typical style. In this chumash that I have in front of me, it's actually written in 1.5 lines. I'm going to read it and try to explain it a little bit. He gives a beautiful interpretation on this choice, a Hasidic explanation, on this choice of words of the Possuk, ha'anoshim al hanoshim. Ha'anoshim al hanoshim, says Sfas Emmes. Bo l'rameis, again, the question here is that it's a strange choice of language. Ha'anoshim al hanoshim would literally translate as the men on the women. Bo l'rameis al mailas ba'al tshuva, says the Sfas Emmes. This Possuk is hinting to us that there is something special specifically about Bali Tshuva. Men, the Sfas Emmes reminds us, were involved in the sin of the Cheto Egel in last week's Parsha. Women were not. So the men who sinned in the Egel, the men who sinned in the Egel were elevated to a higher level than the women who didn't sin by the Egel. Why were the men elevated to a higher level? The men, says the Sfas Emmes, channeled their retzonos, their rotzen means their wants, their desires that were involved in the Cheto Egel, that were involved in the making of the golden calf and the worshipping of the golden calf. They channeled all of those retzonos into building a mishkan and a home for Hashem. The women were never involved in a Cheto Egel in the first place. The women were not interested. The women didn't contribute. They didn't worship it. They were somehow immune to the challenges or the mishaps of the Cheto Egel. Women were not involved. Right? There's a Das Zakanim that says this is the reason why women were given a special Yom Tov that men were not, which is the Yom Tov of Hachodesh, since the Mishkan was dedicated on Hachodesh. All right, be it as it may. The men were involved in the Cheto Egel. Then afterwards, they were instructed to build a Mishkan, construct it, bring money to it. This was, as I mentioned before, one of the purposes of it was a kapora for the Cheto Egel, as a sign to the world that Hashem had forgiven the Jews for the Cheto Egel. So for the men, says the Sfas Emmes, the construction of the Mishkan, bringing the money to the Mishkan, was a moment actually of tshuva. There was a kapora process involved. They had sinned with the Egel, and now they were fixing this. For the women, there was no such kapora involved because they hadn't sinned in the first place. Says the Sfas Emmes, so anoshim al hanoshim means that in this case, the men are actually superior to the women, the opposite pshat of Rashi. Rashi says, he's not explaining pshat, he's giving a Hasidic interpretation, but it's the opposite way of understanding of Rashi. Rashi says, anoshim al hanoshim means the men secondary to the women. The women were more enthusiastic, because the women were spiritually higher than men, as evident by the fact that they were not involved in the sin of the Egel. So therefore, they were more enthusiastic to build a home for Hashem, which v'shachanti b'saycha. The men, says Rashi, who were obviously less spiritually in tune, they also got involved in the construction of the Mishkan, but not as excited as the women. That's Rashi's job. Sfas Emmes says that there's a perspective that goes punkt verkehrt, the other way around. The Sfas Emmes says, don't forget, that the Mishkan is part of kapara, is part of forgiveness for the Cheto Egel. For the men who were involved in the Cheto Egel, not for the women. For the women, there's no kapara involved because there was no sin. So he says the Sfas Emmes reminds us, he says, remember that there's something called Milas Bali Tshuva. There's something called the superiority of a Bal Tshuva. A Baal Tshuva, the Gemara tells us, reaches a higher level than a tzaddik. So yes, of course, it's true that the women had this advantage that they were not involved in the sin of the Egel Azov in the first place, of course. But the men had a different advantage. The men who were involved in the Egel Azov, for them, the construction and the function of the Mishkan is tshuva. No, if a person does tshuva, then in a sense, they reach a higher level than a person who didn't sin in the first place. It's a very nice pshat. So the Sfas Emmes, that's the deeper meaning. Vayakhel anoshim al hanoshim. The men, in a spiritual sense, the men came in a spiritually superior moment than the women, because for them this was a concept of teshuvah. Okay, in the typical Hasidic Gerer, Sfas Emmes was the second Gerer Rebbe. He doesn't explain more than that. He relies it on us to sort of dissect and analyze. But the Vort stands, and it's very insightful. What he's saying is that the Mishkan served different purposes for different people. Right? For some, there was an element of teshuvah involved. For some, there was an element of fixing and cleaning and kapara. That's for the people who were involved in the Chet Egel. For the women, there was no cleanup. They hadn't dirtied themselves in the first place. So in that sense, the Torah is telling us that there was a superiority for the men over the women in a spiritual sense. All right. Let's leave it at that for now. I want to also study with you a Rashi with Hashem's help in Parshas Pekudei, and then I want to try to connect. These two ideas. So again, if your Chumash is still open in front of you, turn to the beginning of Parshas Pekudei. This is a very famous Rashi. We'll study it together and discuss some of the insights and the discussions on this Rashi. So in Parshas Pekudei, the second parsha that we read this week, Moshe Rabbeinu gives very famously a very specific and detailed reckoning of what was done with all of these materials that were contributed to the Mishkan. Elo Pekudei Mishkan, Moshe Rabbeinu gives them an accounting, right? Dollar and cents. Where did all the materials go? What was done with it? That's how the beginning of the parsha starts. And then the parsha goes on to say that they constructed the Mishkan exactly as Hashem had told them to. All right, the Gemara says very famously that Moshe Rabbeinu had to do this because the Jews suspected Moshe Rabbeinu of stealing some of the money, some of the materials that were donated. Right? Sound familiar? Moshe Rabbeinu had actually become rich in the process of the construction of the Mishkan, but it wasn't from the materials donated for the Mishkan. It was actually from the leftover pieces of sapphire out of which Moshe Rabbeinu had carved the luchas. The leftover pieces, Moshe Rabbeinu became wealthy from that, but the Jews suspected him, so he gave a detailed account. Eila Pekudei Mishkan says the Torah in Parshas Pekudei. These are the enumerations of what was done with the Mishkan. These are the accountings of the Mishkan. Mishkan Moshe was instructed by Moshe. Avodas Halavim. It was intended to be the Avodas Halavim means the Levim were the ones who would transport this Mishkan. Excuse me, Pekudei Mishkan, the keeping count of what was done with all the materials. This was done by the Levim, the son of Aaron HaKohen. Okay. Uvetzalel says the Possuk, second Possuk in Parshas Pekudei. Uvetzalel ben Uri ben Chur lamata Yehuda. But an individual called Betzalel, the Torah has mentioned his name a few times. Betzalel, the son of Uri, the son of Chur. By the way, Betzalel at the time of the construction of the Mishkan, the Gemara says, was 13 years old. Betzalel's father, Uri, was the son of Chur. Chur we spoke about in last week's Parsha. He was the one who was killed when he objected to the Jewish people worshipping the Egel Azov. Chur himself is the son of Miriam. His mother is Miriam, Moshe and Aaron's sister. And his father, by the way, is Kolev. Lamata Yehuda, he is from... That is Betzalel ben Uri ben Chur, Lamata Yehuda. He is from the tribe of Yehuda. So Betzalel, the architect, the designer, the mastermind behind the construction of the Mishkan, carries out the construction of the Mishkan exactly as Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, which, as I mentioned before, means that everything happens without any problem at all. Rashi. If you have the Chumash in front of you, follow along. Very famous and very difficult to understand Rashi. Also, Eiskol Asher Tziva Hashem Es Moshe. Says Rashi, Asher Tziva Moshe Ein Ksiv Kan. Elo Kol Asher Tziva Hashem Es Moshe. Rashi quotes from the Gemara. There's a diuk here. There's a nuance in the Possuk that the Gemara picks up on, which, all right, it's difficult to understand why the Gemara is particular about this nuance here when the words Asher Tziva Hashem Es Moshe appear so many times in the Parsha and so many times in the Torah. But either way, the Gemara gets stuck on it here, and the Gemara makes this nuance. The Gemara says the Torah should not have said that Betzalel constructed the Mishkan the way Hashem, exactly in accordance with the way Hashem told Moshe. Shouldn't have said that because Betzalel doesn't know. Betzalel isn't there when Hashem gives the instructions to Moshe, seemingly. Betzalel's not around. It's just Hashem and Moshe. So Betzalel cannot build the Mishkan based on the instructions that Hashem gives Moshe. Betzalel has to build the Mishkan based on the instructions that Moshe Rabbeinu communicates to Betzalel that Moshe Rabbeinu heard from Hashem. So the Gemara doesn't like this. What do you mean Betzalel ben Uri ben Chur Lamata Yehuda does Eis Kol Asher Tziva Hashem Es Moshe? He does what Hashem commands Moshe. He doesn't do what Hashem commands Moshe. He does what Moshe tells him. But yet the Torah doesn't say that. The Torah says he does it based on what Hashem. He does what Hashem tells Moshe. Asher Tziva Moshe, says Rashi, Ein Ksiv Kan. It doesn't say that Betzalel did what Moshe Rabbeinu commanded. Ela Kol Asher Tziva Hashem Es Moshe. But whatever Hashem commanded Moshe Rabbeinu. And what's the difference? It seems the same either way. Says Rashi, this means Afilu Dvorim Shelo Yamar Lo Rabbi. This means that Betzalel constructed the Mishkan in such a way. Betzalel constructed the Mishkan, including in the construction, were things that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't tell him. There were things that Moshe Rabbeinu did not tell him, and yet they were also included in the construction of the Mishkan. That's why the Torah does not say that Betzalel merely constructed the Mishkan according to Moshe Rabbeinu's instructions to him. It says he constructed the Mishkan according to Hashem's instructions to Moshe. Because there were things that Hashem instructed to Moshe that Moshe didn't tell Betzalel, that Betzalel, through intuition, also included those in the construction of the Mishkan. Betzalel intuitively includes these, is aware of this, and includes this, even things that Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai that Moshe didn't tell him. What was this? What is it that Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't tell Betzalel? What is it that Hashem tells Moshe that Moshe doesn't tell Betzalel, that Betzalel nevertheless intuitively includes? Moshe Rabbeinu instructs Betzalel to first construct the Kalim, to first make all the things inside the Mishkan, the menorah, the Mizbeach, the Shulchan, etc. And then to build the structure. Rashi says, Moshe Rabbeinu told Betzalel to make the Kalim, to make the vessels of the Mishkan first, and only after that to make the Mishkan. Betzalel says to Moshe, Minag ha'olam, it's the custom of the world, Lasos tchila bayis, v'achar kach mesim kelim b'toichei, to first build a home, and then to bring the furniture inside it. What do you mean, says Betzalel to Moshe Rabbeinu? First we bring a couch and a dining room table and dining room chairs, right? And a bookcase and a place to put the Shabbos candlesticks, and then you build a house around it. That's not the way people. That's not what people do. First you have a house, and then you put the vessels inside it. Omar Loi, Moshe Rabbeinu told him, Kach shamaiti mipi Hachodesh Baruch. This is what I heard from Hashem. Now Rashi doesn't say what Moshe Rabbeinu means. What did Moshe Rabbeinu mean? This is what I heard from Hashem. The way Moshe Rabbeinu said it, or the way Betzalel said it. The commentaries here on Rashi argue. What does this mean? What was Moshe Rabbeinu saying? Was Moshe Rabbeinu saying, you're right? Eventually Moshe Rabbeinu will agree. But at this point, is Moshe Rabbeinu saying, you're right, that's what Hashem told me? Or is Moshe Rabbeinu saying, no, I'm just telling you what Hashem told me, to build the Kalim first? Not clear. Omar Loi Moshe, but then Moshe Rabbeinu tells him, quote, Betseil Keil Hayisa. You were in the shadow of Hashem, Betzalel. can be divided, says Moshe, into two words, Betzel Kel, the shadow of Hashem. Because definitely this is what Hashem commanded me. And so was done. First the Mishkan and then the Kelim. First the structure and then the vessel. So it seems, again, the simple reading of Rashi is that Moshe Rabbeinu tells him, look at that. You're right. Certainly, this is what Hashem told me. It's like Moshe Rabbeinu told him, it's like you were standing in the shadow of Hashem when Hashem gave me these instructions. Because now that you mention it, Moshe Rabbeinu says, actually, you're right. This is what Hashem told me. Hashem told me to make the Mishkan first, and then to put the Kelim, and then to make the Kelim. Okay. End of Rashi. I don't know if I would be exaggerating to say. I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say one of the most difficult Rashis in the entire Chumash to understand. We don't have time to get into all of the diyukim, all of the, every nuance here in Rashi that's difficult. So we'll just stick to the general questions, which are so incredibly obvious. Rashi's saying that Bezalel intuitively knew or could feel that the Mishkan needed to be constructed, not the way Moshe Rabbeinu told him Bezalel to construct it, but rather the way Hashem had instructed Moshe Rabbeinu to do it. Again, Rashi is saying Bezalel intuitively figured out that the Mishkan should be built, not the way Moshe Rabbeinu told him, but the way Hashem told Moshe. And that is, number one, the reason why the Torah says that he built the Mishkan. He built it according to everything that Hashem instructed Moshe. Implication, not the way Moshe Rabbeinu told him. And that's also the reason, this is also intimated in his name, Bezalel, which means in the shadow of Hashem. It's like when Moshe Rabbeinu and Hashem were talking, Bezalel was lurking in the shadows, and he becomes aware of this. And he's aware of this. Okay. Now let's ask the very obvious questions. I'm just going to ask a few. Again, I don't want to get into this like you can ask 1,000 questions, but I just want to get into the general questions. Number one, why did Moshe Rabbeinu not communicate to Bezalel the instructions of Hashem as he had received them? This is the greatest and ultimate violation of any Navi. Nevi'im who misconstrue the messages that they get from Hashem, any Navi, get capital punishment for this. A Navi who changes the words of Hashem is called a Navi Sheker. We put these Nevi'im to death. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not being hyperbolic. That's the halacha. You take these individuals at the time the capital punishment, the Bezdin carried this out, if a Navi changed the word of Hashem, he was executed. So what does it mean? Moshe Rabbeinu changes the word of Hashem? That's obviously impossible to fathom. Moshe Rabbeinu, Rabban shall call a Navim, the greatest of all, the greatest of them all. I mean, obviously, there's nothing to talk about. Obviously, he wouldn't misconstrue or change the words of Hashem. Okay, obviously. And yet, apparently, when Bezalel challenges him on this, Moshe Rabbeinu says, quote, certainly that's what Hashem said. It sounds like Moshe Rabbeinu is having a realization while this is going on. He didn't understand what Hashem told him. He forgot. He misunderstood. All of these are impossible. They're impossible. They're impossible pretenses to accept. Of course. Okay. Next. So that's question of why did Moshe Rabbeinu change Hashem's word? Or how did Moshe Rabbeinu change Hashem's words? Question number one. Question number two, Moshe Rabbeinu told him, you must have been standing in the shadow of God, as your name indicates. How else would you know that Hashem instructed me to do it differently, to build the Mishkan first and then the Kelim? Also a very strange statement. Bezalel tells Moshe Rabbeinu exactly how he knows that the house should be built before the vessels. He tells him exactly how he knows. Quote, Omer le Bezalel, Minhag ha'olam, lasos tchila bayis, v'achar kach mesim kelim b'toichoi. It's the custom of the world that first you make a house and then you put in the furniture. You don't put in the furniture first and then build a house. That's how Betzalel knew. And he told him that that's how I know. Betzalel's like, you're hiring me as an architect? Here. Rule number one, don't put the couches before you build the house. Does that even take some kind of chacham to figure out? And Moshe Rabbeinu goes, wow, you're in the shadow of Hashem. Moshe Rabbeinu sees divine wisdom in Betzalel's comment when he's literally he's giving him the words, Mina Goilam, the custom of the world is that this is what we do. And then question number 3, and again, I'll leave it at that because you can ask so many hundreds more. And question number 3 is that Moshe Rabbeinu and Betzalel seem to be talking about 2 completely different things. Betzalel says, first you have to build the house, and then you put the kelim inside it. Okay, granted. Moshe Rabbeinu told him first to put, is he understanding that Moshe Rabbeinu told him, first you bring in the kelim, and then you build the mishkan around it? That's not what Moshe Rabbeinu said. Moshe Rabbeinu told him to make the kelim first, and then make the mishkan. But he didn't say that you put the kelim into the mishkan before the mishkan is built, right? What do I mean? If I build a new house, if I build myself a house, please God, afala yidin gesagt, right? In Los Angeles, it costs a pretty penny. You'll take my word for it. But let's say with Hashem's help, I build myself a big, beautiful house. Now it's time to bring furniture into the house. Yes? Okay. Do I have to now go and build the furniture too? No, I can go to the store, or I can go to a storehouse and find furniture that I like and bring them into my house. I don't have to make the furniture after I make the house. And even if I want to make the furniture, I can take ready-made furniture and bring it into my house. And even if I want to design my own furniture all by myself, I can design the furniture, put it in some kind of storehouse, put it in someone else's house until I build my house. And then when I build my house, I'll bring the furniture that I built into my house. Rashi says, Moshe instructed Betzalel to first build the kelim, to first make the kelim, and then afterwards to make the mishkan. Okay, actually, when you read the words, that doesn't seem like a difficult thing to do at all. First make the menorah, then make the mizbeach, then make the shulchan, then make the oren, in whatever order, make all the kelim, and then make the mishkan. What are you going to do with those kelim while you're making the mishkan? Put them in storage. Build put them in someone's tent. The Jews apparently were not short on tents, right? They had beautiful tents. Store them somewhere. What did Betzalel think Moshe Rabbeinu was saying? That we're going to build the kelim and leave them exposed? He tells him, Mina Go'olam is first you build a house and then you bring the kelim into it. Where does Betzalel see in Moshe Rabbeinu's words anything different than this minhag ha'olam? I don't know if my question is clear. They seem to be talking about 2 different things. Moshe Rabbeinu says, go build the kelim and then build the mishkan. Okay, does that mean Moshe Rabbeinu is saying you should bring the kelim into the mishkan before you build the mishkan? No, that's not what Moshe Rabbeinu is saying. He's saying make the kelim. Where will you put the kelim once they're made? Safe place. Maybe Betzalel would keep them in his own living room. Who cares? The Levium would store them. The Dayanim would store them. I don't know. Maybe Moshe Rabbeinu himself could store them. What's the difference? Betzalel says, no, we can't do that. We can't build the kelim first. Why? Because the custom of the world is first to build the house and then to bring the kelim in. Who's talking about whether you build the house first or then bring the vessels inside? Yes, of course, before you put furniture in a house, you need a house. Okay, so once the mishkan is finished being built, only then will the kelim, will the vessels be brought inside it. There was no discussion about that. The question was only what you should make first. If I want to design furniture and I want to design my house, I want to design it all, right? I'm that kind of guy who wants to live in only a house designed by me and vessels made by me. I have to build the house first before I build the furniture? Nonsense. I can build the furniture first. I can even do them both at the same time. Whatever, wherever the inspiration strikes me, that's what I'll do. While I'm building the house, I'm obviously not going to have the furniture inside the house. So I put the furniture somewhere else in the meanwhile. Betzalel's observation seems to have nothing to do with what Moshe Rabbeinu was talking about. Moshe said, I gave you an instruction. Go build the Kalim and then build the Mishkan. He should have gone, built the Kalim, put them in a safe place, and then built the Mishkan. And then when you finish building the Mishkan, take the Kalim that were already built before the Mishkan was built, from the safe place wherever they're being stored, and put them in the Mishkan. No, says Betzalel. In order to do that, we have to build the Mishkan first. Why? And Moshe Rabbeinu is so impressed with his genius, divine wisdom. Where's the wisdom? Where's even the relevance? You must have been in the shadow of Hashem to know that first you build a house and then you bring Kalim into it. Okay. The whole thing is difficult. It is difficult to understand. There's much. I encourage you to study some commentary on this Rashi, because the commentaries fiercely debate. They have some very unflattering things to say about each other, as sometimes happens. I'll read it to you. There's a comment here. There's a comment here from a Mefarish in Rashi called Levusha Oira. He says, Yan Ro'isi Mefarshe Divrei Rashi says, I've seen people interpreting the words of Rashi, Meshabshin Divrei Rashi, they're distorting the words of Rashi, B'dvorim asher olu al libai, with things that Rashi never thought of. And they explain all sorts of different things. He's just very unhappy with some of his fellow commentaries. Okay, I want to fast forward this and just go to what I think is actually I think what I'm saying is very obvious, and just give the foundations of what's going on here. Okay, obviously Moshe Rabbeinu does not distort the words of Hashem. Obviously, Moshe Rabbeinu communicates them to Betzalel exactly as he heard and understood them. Betzalel is obviously saying something in response that makes Moshe Rabbeinu realize that Moshe Rabbeinu, hadn't fully understood the full implications, the full extension of what it was that he heard from Hashem. So when Moshe Rabbeinu hears Betzalel's response to his instructions, Betzalel's response gives Moshe Rabbeinu deeper insights into the words that he heard from Hashem. Which, by the way, this idea that there are insights, this idea, we find this in the entire Torah. Which idea am I referring to? The idea that Moshe Rabbeinu himself will learn deeper insights into the words that he heard from Hashem from the Jews. In all of Torah, there's a very famous story in Gemara Menachos, which we've spoken about before, where the Gemara says Moshe Rabbeinu was put in the back of Rabbi Akiva's classroom. And he hears Rabbi Akiva teaching his students. Says the Gemara, Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't know what they're talking about. And he felt terrible. Until he hears one of the students in the front of the room ask Rabbi Akiva, what's the source of a particular halacha? And Rabbi Akiva says, halacha l'Moshe mit Moshe Rabbeinu hears. Rabbi Akiva say, halacha l'Moshe miSinai, and Moshe Rabbeinu felt better. All right, the Gemara actually says there that Moshe Rabbeinu asked Hashem, why doesn't Rabbi Akiva give the Torah? Moshe Rabbeinu asked Hashem, why doesn't Rabbi Akiva give the Torah? If Rabbi Akiva has insights that Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't have, Moshe Rabbeinu said, Rabbi Akiva should give the Torah. Hashem said, I'm not answering you on that either. Hashem says, no, right? This is what I have decided. But again, the idea is that Moshe Rabbeinu is the Makabel Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu receives the Torah Misinai, gives it over to the Jews. And then there's a concept of Talmud Possuk, that a diligent student sits and is Hachodesh Chidushim in Torah, finds novel insights into Torah. It's all hidden, it's all buried in the words that Hashem gave Moshe Rabbeinu. But again, like the Gemara itself says, Moshe Rabbeinu himself wasn't fully aware on a conscious level of all of the wisdom of Torah that he himself had received from Hashem and given to the Jews. Because every Jew who studies Torah it has their own perspective and is obligated to have their own perspective. And every element of Torah can be understood in so many different directions. In fact, every Jew is obligated to be Hachodesh, to say novel insights into Torah. And yet we say that every novel insight in Torah was all given to Moshe Rabbeinu and Har Sinai, meaning it's all in the Torah that Hashem gave. Okay. So Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu to convey to the Jews that there's a mitzvah to build a Mishkan. And Moshe Rabbeinu does. He gives over the mitzvah, the command, that the Jews should build a Mishkan. The Jews should build a Mishkan for Hashem. Okay. But now let me ask you, what is the purpose of this Mishkan? Hashem says, "V'shachanti b'soicham," I will live there. Okay, but what does that mean? But how does it get expressed? What is the tangible outcome of that? So of course, again, I think I'm saying something very obvious, but of course, for every single Jew experiences the v'shachanti b'soicham in their own way. Right? Let's go back to the Sfas Emmes that we started the Shiur with. The Sfas Emmes says that for the men and for the women who were both involved in the construction of the Mishkan, it was an entirely different experience. For the women, it was just going higher within the realm of holiness, right? For the women, it was a closer connection to Hashem, a deeper. The women were already connected to Hashem. It was going deeper. It was taken to a higher level, etc. For the men who had just worshipped Avodah Zarah or had been involved somehow in the worship of Avodah Zarah, there was a concept of tshuva and tikkun here. Same Mishkan being constructed by one family, a couple, husband and wife. For the man, it's tshuva. For the woman, it's not. So the Mishkan, which was going to be built, was for every single person was going to serve their function, was going to facilitate for them their connection to Hashem in a way that they needed. There's that famous interpretation, right? The commentaries say, why does Hashem say, make for me a Beis HaMikdash, v'shachanti b'soicham, and I'll live in them? It should say, build for me a Beis HaMikdash, v'shachanti b'soicham, and I'll live in it. Very, very famous. The Mefarshim say, v'shachanti b'soicham means Hashem says, b'soich kol echad v'echad miYisrael, which means in every single Jew. So under normal circumstances, we understand that what this means is that even after the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, Rahman al-Islam, Hashem says, build for me a Beis HaMikdash in your heart, and in your soul, and I'll live inside every single Jew. But I think that's shallow, or I think that's not the full extent of it. V'shachanti b'soicham b'soich kol echad v'echad miYisrael means even as the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash stands, every Jew goes to the Beis HaMikdash and connects with Hashem in their way, according to their spiritual standing. Again, I'm basing this on the Sfas Emmes. Sfas Emmes says, for the men it was tshuva, for the women it wasn't. So Moshe Rabbeinu hears Hashem say, build a Mishkan. Moshe Rabbeinu hears Hashem say, from now on, Hashem's presence is going to rest in the Mishkan. And then Moshe Rabbeinu communicates that to the Jews. Now, what function does this Mishkan serve for Moshe Rabbeinu and for the Jews? Is it the same? Well, it's the same Mishkan, but it's going to serve to a degree. It's going to serve a different purpose. All right, let's start. What's it going to do for Moshe Rabbeinu? Well, for Moshe Rabbeinu, this is not guesswork. This is in the Psukim. For Moshe Rabbeinu, this Mishkan is going to be where Hashem is going to speak to him for all eternity. Once the Mishkan was built, Rashi writes this in last week's Parsha. Once the Mishkan was built, Hashem never spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu anywhere else. It was always in the Mishkan. And where in the Mishkan? Specifically through the Kruvim. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu obviously wasn't involved in the Chet Egel. Moshe Rabbeinu, didn't need kapora in that sense. Of course not. Moshe Rabbeinu is the one who communicates to the Jews the word of Hashem. So as far as Moshe Rabbeinu is concerned, what's the function of the Mishkan? The function of the Mishkan is that this is where Hashem will speak to him. What about the rest of the Jews? Everybody had their role. The men needed to do teshuvah. The women didn't. They were given an additional Yom Tov, as I mentioned before. So I think what Rashi means here in this conversation with Moshe Rabbeinu and Betzalel is that what Moshe Rabbeinu is telling, Moshe Rabbeinu tells Betzalel, Hashem instructed us to build a Mishkan. Hashem instructed us how. Hashem instructed us to build vessels in this Mishkan. Now, when it comes to the question of what comes first, whether you build the Mishkan first or whether you build the vessels first, the obvious answer is which is more important. Which one is more important? The one which is more important, you build first. If the vessels are more important, you build them first, put them in storage, and then build the Mishkan. If the Mishkan is more important, then you build it first, and then you construct the Kelim. So which is more important, the structure or the vessels? The answer is it depends. For Moshe Rabbeinu, that from here on and for all times, the Rebbeinu Shalom would speak to him through the Aron itself. Hashem's voice would come to him from between the Mibein Shnei Akruvim, from between the two Kruvim. So the Kelim, and more specifically, not just all the Kelim, specifically the Aron and the Kruvim that sat in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, that was the holiest of things. So Moshe Rabbeinu told him, Lasos tchila kelim, to make the kelim first. I don't even know if Moshe Rabbeinu meant chronologically that the kelim should be made first. I don't necessarily know if that's what Moshe Rabbeinu meant. But Moshe Rabbeinu was telling Betzalel, we're going to build a Mishkan, and the kelim, the vessels, are going to be used as a conduit through which Hashem is going to speak to us. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu is giving the instruction and his understanding of the instruction, which from his perspective, the purpose of it was the Mishkan, was the Aron where Hashem would speak to him. Omar loy Betzalel. Betzalel tells Moshe Rabbeinu, Minhag ha'olam. Betzalel tells Moshe Rabbeinu, there's another part to this Mishkan, which is going to serve a purpose of Minhag ha'olam. We're not all Moshe Rabbeinus. We have a little Moshe Rabbeinu inside of us, but we're not Moshe Rabbeinus. You're a Moshe Rabbeinu. But for the rest of us, we live in a place, we live in a zone, a psychological zone called Minhag ha'olam. All right? Minhag ha'olam means the way the world conducts itself. Minhag ha'olam means a world in which Hashem doesn't speak to us the way Hashem speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu, but a world in which physicality and materialism speaks to us much louder than the voice of Hashem. Minhag ha'olam lasos tchila bayis. As far as the Minhag ha'olam is concerned, Betzalel is saying, the bias is more important. Why is the bias more important? I'll tell you why, I'll tell you why I think the bias is more important. It goes back to what Rashi writes right before that. On the words Mishkan O'Edus, Rashi says that the Mishkan stood as a testimony. Edus Li Yisrael was a testimony for the Jews that Hashem forgave them for the Ma'aser Egel, but Hashem forgave them for the Egel. What? Which part of it was a testimony for the Jews that Hashem had forgiven them for the Egel? Rashi says it was the Mishkan. It was the structure. It was the house. It was the house, the construction of the Mishkan that stood as an edus that Hashem forgave the Jews. That stood as a testimony that the Jews who had sinned and with Avodah Zorah, Gilarais, and Shvichas Damim, as I mentioned last week, had their day of Kapara of atonement. It says, but Betzalel wasn't arguing with Moshe Rabbeinu. He was telling him, Minhag ha'olam, the perspective and the reality in the world in which Jews fail and pervert and soil themselves in a sin called Avodah Zorah, in a sin called Chet Egel. In that world, Minhag ha'olam, lasis tchila bayis. First, you build a house. First, we need kapara. Then listen to these words. V'yachar kach meisim kelim b'toichoi, Betzalel says. All of the kelim that we're going to build, they're all being built, they're all being placed into a Beis HaMikdash. It's all within the context of a Mishkan which is being built as a kapara for the Yidden. But first you need kapara. Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't need the kapara. But Minhag ha'olam in the perspective of the world, first you need the tshuva, and then within the tshuva, within that you bring a menorah and a mizbeach and an aron and everything else. Now I'll tell you what the most amazing part of this is. Says Rashi concludes with the words, V'chein osa, hamishkan tchila, v'yachar kach osa hakelim. Rashi says, oh, that's actually what they did, practically. First the Mishkan and then the Kelim. What does Rashi want? What does Rashi want with those words? It just finished telling me that Moshe Rabbeinu told Bezalel, you must have been in the shadow of God to know this. I still have to try to explain what does that mean. But we just finished saying, Moshe Rabbeinu said, you must have been in the shadow of Hashem to know this. Certainly that's what Hashem told me. Rashi says, oh, by the way, actually that's what they did. They actually did it that way. They built the house first and they kept, really? You have to tell me that now that you've just told me that Moshe Rabbeinu's conceded that what Bezalel is saying is actually what Hashem told him? Oh, actually, Rashi says, and that's actually what they did. On a simple level, it's not a question because Rashi is teaching the Possuk. Bezalel ben Uri ben Chur lemata Yehuda also eskol asher tziv Hashem es Moshe. In the end, he actually does what it was that Hashem had instructed Moshe Rabbeinu. But still, on a deeper level, once you tell me that Moshe concedes the point to Bezalel and tells him you must have been there when Hashem, I mean, you were like there. It's in your name, the shadow of Hashem. Rashi says, oh, by the way, don't worry. That's actually what they did. Why does Rashi add that? So again, I think the point is very simple. I think what Rashi is saying is, look, Moshe Rabbeinu has his perspective on the Beis HaMikdash, on the Mishkan, but Bezalel has his, right? As far as Moshe Rabbeinu is concerned, the Kelim are more important. As far as Bezalel is concerned, Minhag HaOlam, for the Jews who had sinned, they needed first the kapora, they needed first the structure to gain kapora for them, okay? But you know what it's like when you read, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel have these arguments, and we say, Eilu v'eilu divrei Elokim Chaim. Both are the words of Hashem. Okay, beautiful, granted. But what's the bottom line? Halacha. So there's a special siyata d'shmaya. The Gemara talks about this. There's a special siyata d'shmaya that a person should be zoicha, that the halacha should be like them. Hashem imoy, the Torah says about David HaMelech. Hashem imoy, the Gemara says, shalocha k'moisa. The Mishkan was going to service both. Moshe Rabbeinu would find his place in the Mishkan. Bezalel, representing Klal Yisrael, the descendant of Hur who was massacred in the process of the Chet HaEgel, would find their place in the construction of the Mishkan. But which one happened practically? Rashi says, V'chein osa hamishkan tchila. In the end, practically, halacha l'maisa, they followed Minhag HaOlam, not Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? I think it all goes back to the Sfas Emmes' words. Ha'anoshim al hanoshim. Because it's the Torah wants us to know that the perspective of Teshuvah, the idea that the Mishkan would serve as an eternal monument for the reunion between Hashem and the Jews, for the rebuilding of their relationship, for them having gone spiritually to the darkest of places and come back from it. In the words of the Sfas Emmes, Mailas HaTshuva, there's a certain spiritual superiority to that that's greater than everything else. So yes, for Moshe Rabbeinu, the Mishkan would serve the purpose of Hashem speaking to him through it. For Bezalel, for the men, it would serve the purpose of tshuva. They would offer up korbanos on Shabbosim, on Yomim Tovim. Eventually, the Beis Din HaGodol would sit there and decide, make halachic rulings that were relevant to all of Klal Yisrael and to all of Jewish history. But when it was constructed, the emphasis that was placed was Hamishkan Tchila. First the kapora. First get to that place of tshuva. And then machnisim b'toich kelim, and then everything else goes into that. I want to add one more part. I want to add one more word. Moshe Rabbeinu tells him, "You were in the shadow of Hashem." B'tzeil kel, you were in the shadow of Hashem. What's the shadow of Hashem? I need not tell you that God casts no shadow. Ein loy guf, ve'ein loy demus haguf. Of course. The shadow makes it, Moshe says, the shadow makes it sound like he was lurking in the dark. He was and it's in his name, but Seil Kale, somewhere in the dark of the shadows of God, you were standing there. That's how you know. What does it mean? Well, perhaps what it means is that Moshe Rabbeinu was telling him, your perspective on the Mishkan, that the most important part is that it's tshuva and kapara for Klal Yisrael. That comes from the dark side. It does. It comes from the dark side. Because if they had never sinned with the Egel Azav, right? If they had never sinned this way, there would be no need for it. But Seil Kale, there is a divine shadow. There is a divine place that is dark and difficult. What is that? That's the place of sin. Those are the dark corners, right? Where immorality lurks, where the ability of a Jew to turn their back on Hashem 40 days after the giving of the Torah, and that's where it lurks. And that's where Bezalel was coming from, not because he was trying to promote the dark side, but because he said the Mishkan, which will gain kapara, that which will emerge from the dark side, will be even greater. And Moshe Rabbeinu said, Bavadai, now that you say it, Bavadai, Moshe Rabbeinu himself is having a realization. Kach tivli HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, the Rabbeinu Shloim's instruction in building a Mishkan contains a depth, Moshe Rabbeinu said, that is even beyond me. Where Bali Tshuva stand, even great tzaddikim don't stand. Okay, I concluded the story. How am I doing with time? 12:02. I concluded the story, a quick one. A Hasidic story. I've told this before, and I'll say it again because I love it so much. Legend has it that a Yid was eating in the streets on Yom Kippur. Probably cheeseburger, Rahman al-Islam. And he met a Hasidic Rebbe. I heard the story about Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev. It may be a confusion of stories, but be it as it may, the Berditchev or the Tzaddik looks at this Yid who's eating in the streets on Yom Kippur and says, Rebbe Yid, I'm jealous of you. Rebbe, you must be very hungry if you're jealous of me. Why are you jealous of me? He says, in Shemayim, they're more excited about you than about me. I'm standing in shul all day, davening and clapping, banging in my chest and begging and pleading. And you're eating a cheeseburger and they're more excited about you. You know why? Because they're not saying about you in Shemayim that you did an Aveira. They're not saying about you in Shemayim that you're a terrible Jew. There's no such thing as Aveiras and terrible Jews in Shemayim. All they're saying in Shemayim is that you've created an opportunity for yourself to do teshuvah. But Seil Kale Hayisa, you're in the dark place. You're in the dark zone. But the light, the potential that can emerge from this, the Mishkan that will be built from this will last forever, will never be destroyed. I'm standing in shul and, davening and fasting. They're not as excited about me as they are about you. And of course, when the Yid hears that, he's inspired to understand the true nature of his own soul and to return to Hashem with all his heart. The Mishkan stands as an eternal monument that not only, no matter how far and how dark the Jews descend spiritually, can they always do tshuva, and will they always do tshuva, but even more than that, the further away they go, the further they fall, the higher and the greater and the loftier will be their reunion with Hashem. Have a wonderful Shabbos.